The dust of the high plains was a language unto itself, a fine, ochre powder that spoke of drought and endless horizons. It settled on everything, a shroud over the cracked leather of a saddle, a bitter spice in a mouthful of water, a constant, gritty reminder of God's indifference. This was the world of Cole Garrett, and he was a man made of its dust and wind. His face was a roadmap of past sins and future worries, lines etched around his eyes not from laughter, but from squinting into the glare of a bad hand or a coming storm. He rode toward the town of redemption, the name a cruel piece of poetry he no longer found amusing. He was a former gambler, a drifter who had tried to bury his past under acres of unforgiving dirt, but the ghosts of 1,000 losing hands were thirsty, and they always knew where to find him. One last time, the thought called in his mind, familiar and venomous. One good hand. That's all it takes to turn the tide. He knew it was a lie, the oldest lie a man like him could tell himself, but it was a comforting one, and comfort was a rarer commodity than water in this part of the country. The saloon in Redemption was a cage of manufactured joy, smelling of stale beer, sweat, and the cheap perfume that clung to the women who dealt in temporary oblivion. At the center of this web sat Marcus Thorne, a man who wore tailored suits as armor and a smile as a weapon. He owned the saloon, the general store, the bank, and the silence of the sheriff. Thorne dealt in power, and his currency was the desperation of other men. Cole found himself at Thorne's table, the familiar weight of the cards in his hand a sin he couldn't resist. The game wore on, a slow, methodical bleeding of Cole's meager funds. Thorne played with a surgeon's precision, dissecting each man's hopes and fears with casual glances and knowing smirks. The pile of chips in front of Cole dwindled to nothing. "Looks like the earth has swallowed you whole again, Garrett," Thorne purred, his voice smooth as polished river stone. The men at the table chuckled, a chorus of sycophants. Cole's jaw tightened. The shame was a hot coal in his gut. Then, Thorne leaned back, a glint of cruel sport in his eyes. "However, I am a benevolent man. I'll offer you one more hand. My stake," he gestured to the back of the room, where a young Chinese girl stood by the door, still and silent, holding a tray of empty glasses. Her face was a mask of stoicism, but her eyes held a depth that seemed to absorb the room's smoky light without reflecting any of it back. "Her indenture papers," Thorne said, the words slithering into the sudden quiet. "A bit of railroad refuse I acquired. Winner takes her." A cruel joke, perhaps, but a prize nonetheless. A wave of disgust and self-loathing washed over Cole. This was a new bottom. Yet, the gambler's poison was already in his veins. He looked at his cards. A full house. A hand that could save his ranch. He met the girl's gaze across the room. It was unflinching, a silent, damning judgment. With a voice that sounded like gravel grinding together, he said, "Calls, the cards were laid." Thorne's 3 kings were a monument to his arrogance. Cole's 3 aces and 2 jacks were a monument to his damnation. The saloon was utterly still. Cole Garrett had just won a human being. The ride back to the ranch was a funeral procession for the man Cole had tried to be. The girl, whose name he learned was Mai, sat on the wagon seat beside him, a small, straight-backed figure wrapped in a silence more profound than the vast emptiness of the plains. He felt her gaze on him, not accusing, but assessing, weighing him on a scale he knew he couldn't balance. He was a creature of impulse and regret, and she was something else entirely, something forged in a harder fire. His wife, Sarah, was waiting on the porch, her form silhouetted against the lamplight spilling from the doorway, a beacon of the life he was actively destroying. Her face, when she saw Mai, was a canvas of confusion, then dawning horror, then a familiar, bone-deep disappointment. "Cole," she said, her voice tight with a storm of unasked questions. "What have you done?" He had no answer that wouldn't condemn him further. He could only stand there, a king of a broken kingdom, with the spoils of his most shameful victory beside him. Mai slid down from the wagon, her movements economical and precise. She walked not to the house, but to the corner of the corral, where a fence post leaned at a drunken angle, held up by little more than habit. She placed a small hand on the weathered wood, testing its give. The wind picked up, moaning through the eaves of the barn. She looked from the fence to the darkening sky, then back to Cole, who stood frozen by his wife's side. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was quiet, devoid of accent or emotion, yet it cut through the wind and his shame with the sharpness of glass. "It will not hold against the wind," she said. It was a simple observation, a statement of fact. But in the twilight of that ruined evening, it was a prophecy. She wasn't just talking about the fence. She was talking about him. She was talking about everything. And in that moment, the rancher froze in shock, rocked by the terrifying, simple truth of her words. In the days that followed, Mai became a quiet, persistent force on the Garrett ranch. She was not the servant Thorn had treated her as, nor the burden Cole had feared. She was a mirror reflecting the decay he had allowed to fester around him. She rose before the sun, her slight frame moving with a purpose that shamed his own lethargy. She didn't ask for permission, she simply saw what was broken and began to mend it. She patched the roof of the chicken coop with salvaged planks, her small hand surprisingly deft with a hammer. She tilled the hard-packed soil in Sarah's neglected vegetable garden, her patience a stark contrast to his own frustration with the unforgiving land. Cole would watch her from a distance, a knot of confusion and grudging respect tightening in his chest. Her recurring, unflinching gaze followed him, a silent inquiry into the state of his soul. He began to work alongside her, at first out of a sense of awkward obligation, but soon out of a deeper, unnameable need. He found himself sinking new fence posts, his muscles screaming in protest, the rhythm of the work a penance. He was rebuilding more than a fence. With every swing of the sledgehammer, he was trying to shatter the man he had been in that saloon. Foreshadowing arrived on horseback. Two of Thorn's men, rough-hewn figures with lazy, cruel eyes, rode the perimeter of his property one afternoon. They didn't stop, didn't speak. They just watched, their presence a promise of future trouble, a reminder that Thorn's games were never truly over. Later that week, an old neighbor, a man whose face was as cracked and dry as the riverbed, stopped Cole on the road. "You be careful, Cole," the old man rasped, his eyes darting nervously toward town. "Thorn's got a long memory. He don't like losing. Not a hand, not a horse, not anything. That little joke of his? It was a test. And you failed it by winning." A storm gathered on the horizon one evening, the clouds a bruise of purple and grey that mirrored the disquiet in Cole's heart. The air grew thick and heavy with unspoken things. Inside the small cabin, the light from the lantern cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. Sarah, whose initial fear had softened into a cautious, maternal concern, sat with Mai at the small wooden table, mending one of Cole's shirts. Cole sat in the corner, cleaning a rifle, the scent of gun oil filling the air. He wasn't truly cleaning it, he was holding onto it, an anchor in the rising tide of his anxiety. He listened as Sarah, in her gentle way, finally breached the walls of Mai's silence. "Where was your home?" Sarah asked softly. Mai's hands, which were darning the worn fabric with impossibly small and perfect stitches, stilled for a moment. She looked at Sarah, and for the first time, Cole saw a flicker of something beyond resilience in her eyes, a deep, ancient pain. "My home was a village by a wide river, in a place you have no name for," Mai began, her voice a low murmur. She told them of the journey across the ocean, a nightmare of sickness and loss. She spoke of the promises of gold and prosperity that turned to the dust of railroad camps and servitude. Her father, a proud man of learning, had been tricked by men working for Thorn, signing a contract whose terms were a cage of debt. When he realized the deception and tried to organize the other Chinese workers, Thorn had him silenced. Not with a bullet in the open, but with a quiet, brutal beating in the dark, an example to the others. "Thorn does not kill with guns," Mai said, her gaze now distant, seeing ghosts Cole could only imagine. "He kills with paper and with fear. He took me as payment for a debt my father no longer owed. My unflinching gaze is not strength. It is all I have left. When you have nothing, you learn to see everything." The story settled in the room, heavier than the coming storm. Cole looked down at the rifle in his hands. He had thought this was about his own redemption. He was wrong. It was about justice. Thorn began to squeeze. It started subtly, a tightening of a noose Cole hadn't even realized was around his neck. The creek that bisected his land, his only reliable source of water, began to shrink. Downstream, Thorn had filed a new water rights claim, a perfectly legal maneuver that was slowly and deliberately bleeding Cole's ranch dry. The grass in his pastures turned a sickly yellow-brown. Then the supplies in town were cut off. The general store, owned by Thorn, was suddenly out of flour, then salt, then feed for his livestock. The blacksmith, a friend of 10 years, couldn't look Cole in the eye when he said he was too busy to shoe his horse. Thorn's psychological warfare was masterful. He was isolating them, starving them out, making them pariahs in their own valley. Cole's old self, the cornered animal, began to stir. The urge to ride into town, to confront Thorn with his fists and the fury that burned in his gut, was a constant, gnawing temptation. He felt the pull of violence, the simple, satisfying answer to a complex problem. But Sarah stood in his way, her presence a quiet but unbreakable dam against his rage. "Don't, Cole," she pleaded one night, her hand on his arm. "Don't let him turn you back into the man you were. That's what he wants. He wants you to break the law so he can use it to crush you." Her words were the truth, but the truth was a bitter pill. It was Mai who showed him another way. She led him not toward confrontation, but toward survival. With a willow branch, she showed him how to divine for water, tapping the dry earth until she found a damp spot where a well could be dug. She fashioned snares from wire and twine, catching rabbits and quail in the brush. She was a creature of resilience, her knowledge born from a life of having nothing but her own wits. Her quiet, pragmatic strength was a different kind of weapon, one that Thorn couldn't counter with his money or his influence. She was teaching him to endure, and in doing so, was fortifying the very foundations of his changing soul. The found family, born of a cruel joke, a weary rancher, his steadfast wife, and a girl with the eyes of a survivor, was digging in for a siege. The breaking point came with the first snow of the season. Thorn, impatient and incensed by Cole's stubborn refusal to crumble, decided to abandon subtlety. He rode out to the Garrett ranch at dusk, a half-dozen hired thugs at his back. They were not there to talk. The flickering torch in one man's hand told Cole everything he needed to know. They were there to erase the problem, to burn his defiance to the ground and take back what Thorn considered his property. But the Cole Garrett who met them at the fence was not the same man who had slunk out of the saloon weeks earlier. His weariness had been burned away, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. This was his land. This was his family. The confrontation was not a clean, heroic stand. It was a desperate, chaotic scramble for survival. As Thorn's men advanced, Cole fired from the cover of the barn, his shots aimed not to kill but to cripple, to drive them back. Sarah, her face pale but her hand steady, stood in the doorway of the cabin with a double-barreled shotgun, a silent, unmovable guardian. It was Mai, however, who turned the tide. While the men were focused on the gunfire, she slipped out the back of the cabin, a shadow in the falling snow. With a speed and silence that was unnerving, she released the latch on the horse corral. The panicked animals, smelling the smoke from the torch, stampeded directly into the flank of Thorn's advancing men, scattering them in a flurry of hooves and panicked shouts. In the ensuing chaos, Cole moved. He confronted Thorn near the broken fence line, the very spot Mai had prophesied would not hold. There were no grand speeches. Thorn, his face contorted in a mask of fury, sneered, "You're still just a gambler, Garrett. And this is a hand you can't win." Cole looked past him, at the light in his home, at the two women he was protecting. "I'm not playing anymore," he said, and the fight was short, brutal, and ugly. It ended with Thorn on the ground, his slick charm shattered, his power broken not by a bullet, but by the raw, desperate strength of a man with everything left to lose. He and his remaining men fled into the darkness, leaving behind only the scent of smoke and the promise of a new, uncertain dawn. The silence that followed the retreat of Thorn's men was heavier than the gunfire had been. It was filled with the panting breaths of exhaustion, the smell of gunpowder, and the soft hiss of falling snow on the scorched earth where the torch had been dropped. The ranch was wounded. A section of the barn was blackened, the fence was trampled, and Cole's arm throbbed from a deep gash. But they had held. They had stood their ground, and they were still standing. The weeks that followed were a time of quiet, deliberate rebuilding. The physical work of mending the barn and the corral was arduous, but it was the emotional mending that took the most effort. The confrontation had stripped away all pretense. Cole and Sarah spoke with a raw honesty they hadn't shared in years, a conversation held over coffee in the pre-dawn dark or while wrapping Cole's bandages. He told her of the deep well of failure he felt he'd been drowning in, and she told him of her fear, not of Thorn, but of losing the man she knew he could be. Their bond, tested by his gambling and her disappointment, was forged anew in the fire, stronger and more resilient than before. Mai's transformation was the most profound. She was no longer just a catalyst or a survivor, she was a daughter. The unflinching gaze began to soften at the edges. She started to share pieces of her life before Thorn, teaching Sarah the names of herbs from her homeland that she found growing wild in the hills, her quiet voice weaving stories of a world away. One afternoon, Cole found her sketching in the dirt with a stick, creating intricate characters he didn't recognize. "It is my name," she said, without looking up. The name my mother gave me. She was reclaiming not just her safety, but her identity. The town, too, began to shift. Thorn's power, once absolute, had been shown to be hollow. His aura of invincibility was shattered. People who once avoided Cole's gaze now gave him a slow, respectful nod. The blacksmith showed up one morning, unasked, to repair their wagon wheel, his apology unspoken but understood. A small crack had appeared in the dam of fear, and through it, a trickle of courage was beginning to flow. The seasons turned, chasing the memory of the snow into the green promise of spring. The creek, its flow unimpeded, ran full and clear. The new fence post stood straight and tall against the skyline, not a barrier to keep the world out, but a line drawn in the dirt, a declaration of home. The ranch, once a monument to Cole's neglect, was now thriving, a testament to the combined resilience of the three souls who tended it. Cole Garrett was a changed man. The ghosts of the poker tables had finally fallen silent, their whispers replaced by the steady rhythm of the land and the quiet contentment of his home. He found a new kind of wealth, not in the turn of a card, but in the rich, dark soil under his fingernails, in the warmth of Sarah's hand in his, and in the rare, bright sound of Mai's laughter as she helped bring in the harvest. His internal monologues, once a torrent of self-recrimination, were now quiet reflections. He no longer saw his past as a brand of failure, but as the long, winding path that had, against all odds, led him here. He had been given a last chance not in a saloon, but on his own porch. Redemption wasn't a town you rode into, it was a home you built, post by post, day by day. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon in strokes of orange and violet, the three of them sat on the porch. Sarah leaned her head on Cole's shoulder. Mai sat on the steps, whittling a piece of wood into the shape of a bird. No words were needed. The piece was a palpable thing, a blanket settling over them. A cruel joke in a dusty saloon had become an unlikely blessing. A man had lost his soul at a card table and found it again in the unflinching gaze of a girl who showed him not what he was, but what he could be. The story of Cole Garrett isn't just about a single poker hand. It's a testament to the truth that a person's real character is forged in the aftermath of their worst mistakes. It is a reminder that sometimes, the greatest act of courage is not to fight, but to rebuild, and that a family is not always the one you are born into, but the one you are brave enough to fight for. The frontier was littered with the graves of men broken by the harshness of the land and the darkness within themselves, but a few, like Cole, found a different path. They learned that strength wasn't about domination, but about endurance, and that hope could take root in the most barren of soils, nurtured by the simple, powerful acts of loyalty and love. A cruel joke set a fire, but instead of consuming him, it burned away the rot and illuminated the man he was always meant to be. If you reckon a man's worth isn't measured by the hand he's dealt, but how he plays the one he's given, then you understand the story of the Garrett Ranch. Pull up a chair and subscribe to our channel, because there are more tales from the frontier where courage is the only currency that truly matters, and redemption can be found in the most unexpected of places.